Hey folks, yesterday we talked about what kinds of values get reflected in definitions of American food or national cuisine more broadly. Today we're doing the same kind of thing as we're thinking about what kind of values get reflected in discussions about authenticity and how we label certain things authentic or don't, or why and why not. Obviously, the idea of authenticity is very closely related to the idea of national food. We often use authenticity to measure the supposed accurateness of a national food, how closely it resembles what we think the real food of a place is. Clearly, authenticity goes way beyond national cuisines, though. What's authentic barbecue, for instance? If you got lots of barbecue fans in a room, you'd have a big ruckus because you'd have people from North Carolina, South Carolina, Memphis, Tennessee generally, St. Louis, Chicago, Texas. Good luck getting all these people from all these places who have very distinct barbecue traditions to agree on what authentic barbecue is. They all know what authentic barbecue is because it's what they know. Everyone's got their own version that jives with their own history, their own family traditions, their own regionalities. And these feelings about authentic anything when it comes to food can run very deep. For barbecue fans, you have your own style, and the other styles are just gross, right? You'd never eat it. There's no redeeming qualities. You might think it shouldn't even be called barbecue. It's just some bastardization of what once was good barbecue, and things got messed up along the way. And you have the right way. You have the real tradition. You have the real authentic barbecue. So we know the idea of authenticity can be tricky, but we still use it. And grab a cookbook at random. Google a recipe or a dish that you want to make, and it won't be long before you will find someone describing something as authentic. So when you think about it, we know the idea of authenticity is vague at best, but precisely because it's so ubiquitous in the way we talk about certain kinds of foods, especially foods that aren't our own, it's really worth exploring. So just like we did with national food before, I want you to think about why you think about what you do when you think about something as authentic or not. For today, we're reading two very different kinds of articles stylistically. The first one, Kevin Alexander, Why Authentic Food is Bullshit. Authenticity, according to him, is, quote, complete and utter marketing garbage designed to allow eaters to smugly lord their food choices over others. You'll notice right away the writing is really energetic. It seems kind of disruptive, subversive, rebellious. There's a lot of cussing. He gives a lot of really good reasons why the idea of authentic food really doesn't mean what people think it does, and that it's basically impossible to determine authenticity of anything. And his main goal in the article is to really get people to stop using the term. And that's fair enough. He's decided it's pernicious and destructive, and we should stop with it. But that doesn't mean, and I agree with a lot of the stuff in the article, but that doesn't mean we should stop thinking about it. Even if we agree not to use it anymore, we do need to think about it because so many people do use it. And the idea of authenticity, when you look at how many people do use that term, suggests it has a much deeper value and function than just marketing garbage, as Alexander claims. It means something, and it has a power, even if it means something else or something other than what people intend it to mean. That is to say, it's very meaningful in terms of revealing aspects about culture, even if it can't say anything useful about food. The question I want you to keep in mind while reading is whether authenticity can in fact be useful at all, and how can it be useful, even if that means we have to use it differently from how we do. And I think both the articles that we read for today sort of make that point very well. I want to highlight 2 points from the Furrow article. Dwight Furrow has an article about authenticity. It's from a book called American Foodie, which I think is a great title. Like Alexander, he's very skeptical of the concept, but sees the necessity of engaging with it. Furrow starts off talking about how it's common to use food and food traditions as a way of establishing normative authority, which is to say that communities in part define themselves, sometimes national communities, sometimes more regional ones, barbecue communities maybe, defined in part by how you eat. And if you eat like us, then you're one of us. And if you don't eat like us, you're someone else. You're part of a different community. And it can be tempting to use food authenticity and see the authenticness of something as kind of a cultural boundary. And it becomes almost a way of measuring how much you belong to a certain group, how much you eat like what you think of the authentic food is. But Furrow points out that history suggests otherwise. Unstable community identities and porous cultural boundaries render debates about authenticity meaningless. What's considered authentic is always changing. According to Furrow, there are two very different kinds of authenticity. And I think this is a really smart way of thinking about it. I think there's probably more than two ways, but this is a good start. The first one, I think, is the one that most people use without really thinking much about it. The idea of authenticity as a measure of historical accuracy. So recreating food according to some long-standing historical tradition. And you can imagine why people would want to employ this definition. It's a tangible connection to the past. You're eating the past. You're tasting the past, as we talked about before. You're participating in the real culture of a place by eating this traditional dish. The other kind of authenticity that Furrow talks about, and I think this is really interesting, he calls expressive authenticity. So very different from historical accuracy. The idea is in expressive authenticity, you're going after the kind of emotional effect. Rather than focusing on ingredients or techniques or presentation or flavor profiles, you're thinking about sort of how the person is going to process it. And you're thinking a lot less about physical taste and a lot more about cultural taste. So a few times ago, we talked about the banana. And we talked about how people in the 1890s, when it first started to appear in America, or the 20s and 30s when it started to become a little bit more popular, the 40s and 50s when it shows up in all those Jell-O salads, we can't taste the banana in the same way because culturally it means something totally different, right? Every gas station has one at the counter you can buy. They hand them out at the end of like races. They're just everywhere, so they don't taste the same and they don't mean the same thing to us. So what now could replace the banana? Maybe not in the same texture, definitely not the same taste, but is there another tropical or whatever fruit that you could sort of plug in for the banana to create that same effect? And I think this is a really great way of thinking about authenticity because it makes the concept almost way more useful than the historical accuracy version. I think there's a lot more than two ways to think about authenticity, but these two are a great way to start thinking about it because Furrow's getting us to think about kinds of authenticity. And he's avoiding any kind of single spectrum where you can measure the authenticness of something by a flavor profile or by a certain spice or by what it looks like or whatever. A few points from the noteworthy readings that I want to highlight. Again, these are optional, but when they make good points that I think should inform the way we think about the topic for the day, I want to point them out to you. And again, if you're using these in your reading reflections or other assignments, please make sure you're noting that so you can get credit for that work. One is to think about the chronological dimension of authenticity. The Rachel Lawden article in the noteworthy section encourages us to think historically about authenticity. If we think historically, she says, authentic mostly means subsistence. And as recently as the early 20th century, so not really that long ago, countries now renowned for their cuisines, France, Italy, anywhere in Europe, peasants had the sparest and meagerest of diets. Thin, watery soups, dark, thick, rye breads, chestnuts, mushrooms, berries, whatever they could find in the woods next to their house. Definitely not what most of us would want to read if we bought a fancy, authentic Italian cookbook and then the recipe was go find some stuff that's withering in your garden and throw it in some water and then, soak it up with your stale bread. That's what people were doing. That's not what we want, right? So this suggests how complexity, in a way, can be a metric of authenticity, right? Truly authentic food, thinking historically, is very simple. It's survival. Right? But on the other hand, we want to see in what we think of authentic food as stuff that has an element of cultural refinement to it. It might be every day, but there's some level of sophistication, right? So we have two ends of the spectrum. We have culturally refined food and we have subsistence food. Going beyond subsistence for a second, we have to remember a lot of authentic food is not palatable to people from other cultures. Think about Furrow's idea of normative authority here. We define ourselves by what we eat and what we don't eat. So horses, dog, most bugs. You can even use lactose or dairy or rawness of foods. These are all things that really define food communities in very real ways. And even people who crave authenticity would not want to eat some of these foods that are truly authentic to another culture because they're so far outside their own cultural boundary. Also in the noteworthy section, there's an article by Sarah Kay, Yelp reviewers, Authenticity Fetish is White Supremacy in Action. She analyzed tens of thousands of Yelp reviews and tried to see from the data how people described authenticity, words that got paired, topics that people were commenting on. The title of her article is misleading. She doesn't talk about really white supremacy, but she does argue that saying something is authentic is necessarily racist. And actually, I think that's too strong of an argument. I think you can talk about authenticity in lots of different ways, as Furho points out. And it's not necessarily racist. It may be, but it's not necessarily so. She talks a lot about price and how there's this common perception or trope in Yelp reviews that ethnic food is supposed to be cheap. And if it's not cheap, it's not authentic. Well, price really doesn't have anything to do with authenticity when you think about it. But why is there that sort of knee-jerk connection between authentic food and cheapness when you're talking about ethnic food? What does that imply? If you're not charging cheap prices, you're not providing an authentic experience. You're using fancy, inauthentic ingredients, or you're not doing it right. It's supposed to be cheap. That's part of the thing. What does that imply, though? It implies, from the reviewer's perspective, your people are poor. Your culture is poor. You have tasty food and I want it, but my food is expensive because my culture is expensive and yours is poor. And you should give me your tasty food at cheap prices because that's what you do. You are here to do that for me. Why do we associate cost with authenticity at all? It really has nothing to do with the cooking and has nothing to do with the ingredients. Food prices are highly regional, highly local specific things. But using price is a very easy metric to judge authenticity, and it's a lot easier than doing the hard work of thinking about what actually constitutes authenticity. And often the reason for making a statement about authenticity via price or anything else is a kind of cultural performance, right? Asserting your own expertise and raising your own cultural standing by saying, I know what this should be. I am an expert. So things like Yelp reviews may not have much accuracy in terms of labeling things authentic or not, but they have tremendous value for us in understanding the culture of the people who use that term and what they're really implying with their labeling of something as authentic or not. And by the way, these reviews, Yelp reviews and other kinds of reviews where people talk about authenticity, have real ramifications. When authenticity becomes a criteria for a review, the restaurant loses either way. So think about, we talked about price. Think about decor for a second. A restaurant might try to look authentic, right? So people sort of give it reviews for being authentic, but then receive lower ratings for being too stereotypical and too cliche. But maybe they'll have a sort of more modern, sort of updated, fancy interior, very contemporary, nice design, and then get dinged on the reviews for not being authentic. Clearly, authenticity is not just marketing garbage, as Alexander says, when it can force you to close your restaurant. So it has real meanings, it has real power, however misguided the use might be. So we should engage with it. We should think about what this means when people do it. As you're going through the readings, please keep thinking about how many kinds of authentic there might be. But it's a very multi-layered concept that can be thought about on a variety of levels. There's no one right way we should think about authenticity. We shouldn't necessarily stop using it. We shouldn't use it in any one particular way all the time. We just want to take a broad view in understanding what the issues are, and especially what the implications are for talking about authentic food. Furho has a great quote in his article that there are as many authentic Italian recipes as there are Italian grandmothers. You can replace Italian with any nationality, of course, but this should make us think about how individualistic a judgment of authenticity is, even though, ironically, it's meant to be a generalization about food quality and the realness, the historic accuracy of food. Lastly, let me bring up the syllabus very quickly to say a word about the discussion post assignment. Here we go, June 9th. Here's the syllabus for today. Instead of a regular reading reflection, today you're going to do a discussion post. The most common suggestion I got from students last summer was to have a little bit more student interaction and sort of engage with each other a little bit more. Obviously quite limited in an asynchronous online class, but we can do a little bit. And many of them suggested doing an occasional discussion board post. So that's what we're going to do. For this assignment, you are invited/expected to respond to a previous post. It doesn't have to be the post immediately before yours, but find one that you want to engage with. As always, your post should show your familiarity with the readings, but please make sure you're actually responding to what the person is saying. You can agree, you can disagree, suggest variations on ideas, bring up some new suggestions that maybe you think the other person missed from the readings, ask questions. just try to engage with it. I think it's a fun way of having a little interaction without getting too far away from our reading reflections. I have a list of questions here. These are things that you should be thinking about and commenting on, but don't just do these. Make sure you're engaging with the other post as well. Okay, one last point. Please remember, from a historical perspective, what is considered authentic is always changing. Because sort of at its essence, it's one culture's view. I mean, it's one person from one culture, their view of another culture's cuisine. But as we've already seen, and we'll see over and over again throughout the month, culture is always changing. Cultural tastes are always changing. Therefore, anything that you might label as authentic or national or regional, for that matter, there's always variations. There's always permutations, adaptions, rejections, evolutions, and so on. So if someone in conversation tells you some kind of food is authentic, okay, you should be skeptical. And some questions should immediately come to mind. What kind of authentic do you mean? Exactly who is this authentic to? What area? What geography? What time period? What's the essence of the dish that is or isn't being replicated? What are the key ingredients that make it so special? How do you know what authentic is for this place? Asking these questions should effectively cut off a pointless argument about authenticity. You're an expert now. You can thank me later. See you tomorrow.